All right, good morning. So this will be a little different because we're moving into the core of Minneapolis and trying to look at how we focus on really two, I'm going to call them degraded landscapes. And it's interesting if you look across the core of Minneapolis, and you can see this is quite different than the past two presentations you've seen. I'm going to look at a project we call River First, which is an initiative in the north end of the river, the upstream end of the river through Minneapolis. And then another project around Lake Hiawatha in the south part. Both of these are initiatives of the Park Board in Minneapolis. And what's important about just that is that the Park Board in Minneapolis was different than any other parks organization in the state of Minnesota. It's one of the very few independent parks organizations in the country. We're actually created by an act of the legislature in 1883. So we've been around for 135 years as the body responsible for parks in the city of Minneapolis. And interestingly, because we've been around longer than some parts of Minneapolis, we have land in Edina, St. Louis Park, Hopkins, Edina, St. Anthony, Robbinsdale, Golden Valley, and a total of, getting to a total of 6,800 acres of parkland serving the residents and visitors to Minneapolis. So what's important also about Minneapolis, if you look across those 135 years, you see different eras of kind of park development. You can look back to parks like Loring Park near downtown Minneapolis, which was created in an era where parks were manufactured landscapes created for strolling on a Sunday afternoon. There were no recreation activities. It was just people, you can imagine people getting dressed in their Sunday best, and they would go out and they would walk along a path. They would look at a created pond, a created landscape, and that was where recreation was. We can move ahead into the 40s and 50s when it was kind of the steel pipe and butt-burning slides that lots of us probably grew up with, where that was the focus of recreation. We started to get into outdoor fields. We eventually moved into an era where we were building recreation centers and community centers in the 1970s. The Park Board has 47 recreation centers scattered across the city. But the era we're in now is focused on ecology and equity. And in fact, when we look at these two projects, they're really great demonstrations of both. And for us, it's really important to look at it from a perspective of equity because in 2015, when I came to the Park Board, we did a deep analysis of how we had been investing in parks, and we found we were disinvesting in parklands in the poorest parts of Minneapolis. We were directing resources to South Minneapolis, to areas around the lakes, and forgetting areas around the poorest and most diverse parts of our own community. We've changed that now. We have equity metrics that are put in place by our own ordinances. We're the only organization in the country that actually invests on the basis of equity in the physical capital in parks. So this is the era that we're now in, if you look across that 135 years. River First is an initiative that started in 2012 with a competition, but to understand River First, you have to go back to Horace William Shaler Cleveland, who was invited by civic leaders in Minneapolis to come and speak about what a park system should be. So this was the beginning of Minneapolis parks. People decided Minneapolis was going to be different. They invited Cleveland to come, and he apparently was known, I'm a landscape architect, this is what I aspire to. He was a landscape architect. He could incite crowds to a cyclone of applause. But he had ideas about what parks in America should be, and he had the idea in Minneapolis that we could create a continuous park system. And eventually it became, in its first evolution, this idea of a system of grand boulevards that would link through the city. And that was that was his first version. Within 12 years, it turned into this kind of a map, and you can begin to see the beginnings of Minnehaha Parkway. You can begin to see how we're starting to look along the riverfront. You can see the chain of lakes as part of that, what became known and was known today as the Grand Rounds. This started 135 years ago, and my job, I'm still working on completing this in Minneapolis. So that's where River First came from. And it started with his idea when he first saw the gorge in Minneapolis, the gorge of the Mississippi in Minneapolis, the only gorge on the Mississippi, and he was enthralled by it. He called it a priceless jewel, and that became the foundation. So now we look across the scope of the Mississippi River in Minneapolis, and we have the area around Minnehaha Falls. We have the Mississippi Gorge Regional Park. We have the Central Mississippi Riverfront Regional Park in downtown, which we're trying to rename to be the St. Anthony Falls Regional Park. And in the upper stretch, we have an incomplete park, which we call Above the Falls, and that became the focus of River First. But it's going back 130 some years to the work of Cleveland. This is his riverfront. This is what he saw when he came and saw the gorge. I don't know if it's exactly that. This was probably from about 10 years after he was in Minneapolis, but he did work in Minneapolis designing parks and building the parkway system for about 12 years. And this is what the parkway system started as in Minneapolis. So even in about 1917, we had the beginnings of the parkway system, which we're still trying to build out. A more grand vision for the portion of the riverfront in downtown. And to give you a little bit of orientation, here's the Stone Arch Bridge, which still exists. Here is the Hennepin Avenue Bridge, which was originally and somehow now, 100 years later, turned back into a suspension bridge. But this was the vision of the riverfront in Minneapolis. And we can look to the portion of River First that starts actually in this area here. We will talk about an area that's upstream at something called Halls Island, but it's this portion here that became the major focus for River First. And so today, this is our grand round system. We can start with Victory Memorial Drive, Theodore Wirth, through the chain of lakes, Minnehaha Creek Regional Trail, up through the riverfront, to the central riverfront, and then a gap. And again, when we look at this from a perspective of equity, this is North Minneapolis, Northeast Minneapolis. They don't have access to the same kind of riverfront amenities that the rest of the people in Minneapolis do. We also have this piece over here, which we kind of, we call it the missing link. I've been trying to get it renamed the Bridal Veil Regional Trail, so it actually has some positive power beyond the missing link. But we're going to focus on this area right here as River First. And this is the area that we're looking at. It's largely industrial. Here's 94 reaching out to the north of Minneapolis. You can see back, this is a few years old, so here's the Metrodome, the core of downtown Minneapolis, the Lowry Avenue Bridge when it was under construction. So this is the area that we're imagining to be the Above the Falls Regional Park, a 90-acre park. And even though it doesn't look like it, we have acquired about 50 of the 90 acres to make this regional park. And we still have a long ways to go. What's interesting about this, also as a parks organization, and in my position as Assistant Superintendent of Planning, I'm also managing commercial real estate. So we own these properties here. We own another property that's just upstream here. We own that building right there. We own several properties along that we're renting out until the time comes for them to become a park. We're trying to work with the city of Minneapolis so they don't store their garbage trucks and maintain them on the riverfront. This is, there's a company called Northern Metals which shreds metal on our riverfront. So we're evolving this through a really grand plan that was known as River First. And it moved beyond just the river to say, what should those industrial uses be? How could we link across the freeway, build a lid across the freeway to connect to Farview Park in Minneapolis? And how can we reach far back into the community to connect to Columbia Golf Course? So it wasn't just about the river, it was a reimagination of land uses that would really bring people in greater numbers to the river, but also reimagine how those intervening uses can be better related to the ecology of the river in North Minneapolis. What becomes really important to us as we start to move through improvements is that we have a very degraded riverfront in North Minneapolis. It's a working riverfront. It was you'll see a photograph in a minute of the Upper Harbor Terminal. It was Minneapolis's port. And we find very little landscapes that are actually like what the riverfront should be. In fact, big portions of the riverfront are maintained by piles of concrete rubble to keep them from eroding, or sheet pile walls. And our goal, and it's going to take decades and millions of dollars, our goal is to put in place landscapes that look like this along the river. And we've started to do that already in some of our projects, and I'll end the River First piece on that. But we've looked at this and how we can still have industry, but we can create more ecologically appropriate edges that treat the river properly and bring human activity to the river in the right ways. So we've looked at it from the perspective of not just the plantings, the paths, but also the habitat that we're creating as we move up and down the river in different places along this about 4-mile stretch. In this diagram, the River First initiatives are the ones that are highlighted in green with the kind of green flags. So we'll talk about Upper Harbor Terminal. We'll talk about this link along that reaches all the way over to Theodore Wirth Park. But what becomes important in this diagram is that it's beginning to take this last stretch of the riverfront and tie it in with the rest of the grand rounds, with Theodore Wirth Park, Bede-Makaska, Lake of the Isles, and Lake Harriet. So we begin to create a system through the city where ecology can become prominent in our park system. Our partner in this, and I mentioned, and this is important because this is millions of dollars of activity, is the Minneapolis Parks Foundation. They've helped us initiate a project at Waterworks, which I'll share in a minute, which is a $17 million venture in its first phase. We don't have the resources on our own to do that, but we have great philanthropic partners who are helping advance these ideas all the way up and down the river. So I'm going to talk really briefly about 5 projects, I think. And I'll start with an area called Waterworks, where this is the downtown riverfront. This is the area where we're dealing with trying to make this into a park. It looks something like this today. And we're actually reconstructing buildings in the Occidental Mill and in the ruins of the Bassett Mill, which some people might know better as the Fugia from the 1970s. So we're creating a new park in this location, which will somehow turn into this within about a year. Where the river's over here, we still have our parkway. The ruins of the mills will be turned into a restaurant and gathering spaces with a kind of an impromptu amphitheater along the side of the hill. There's another view of it looking back, and you can begin to see the mills and the way that, importantly, this connects back into downtown. And for us, when we look at this area, this part of the park system gets about 2.8 million visitors per year, and we see that growing to about 4 or 5 million visitors a year within about 5 years. So it's not just that we are trying to provide parks here. We're recognizing the changes in our community. People are coming out to parks in greater numbers than ever, and we're trying to create a way to have them be able to not just see the river, but importantly to be able to get down and touch the river, be in the river. We can move upstream a little bit, and the evolution of the most upper part of the river in Minneapolis has been important since the closure of the lock and dam just a few years ago. We no longer have commercial navigation on the riverfront. We still have the river rats doing their thing, but within weeks of the closure of the dam, we would see flotillas of kayakers up and down this stretch of the river. There's an entirely new kind of ecology on the river that's become important. And so as we look at that reaching northward through now above the Falls Regional Park and River First, we see really importance being connections across this piece of land, which is Ole Olson Park, and other kinds of riverfront trails that will accommodate bicyclists and pedestrians, but importantly reach down to the river in more appropriate ecological ways. We also see really important connections being built across the city. The city of Minneapolis reconstructed 26th Avenue North between the riverfront and Theodore Wirth Regional Park. Theodore Wirth is another gem of our system. 739 acres. You can walk through parts of Theodore Wirth Regional Park and not know that you're just a mile or two from the core of one of the largest cities in the Midwest. But we can reach all the way across the river, across the city, and land in the river at an overlook. Here's Ole Olson Park right here. We have about 400 feet to make a connection that would link together 40 miles of bicycle and pedestrian facilities for people in North Minneapolis by landing at the river and making 400 feet of connections through some active industrial areas. And here you begin to see that. Here's 26th Avenue North and overlook. This is the piece that we have to create right through here. And we're dealing with this kind of an industrial landscape. When I look at it, it's like this is the story of the upper riverfront. It's industrial. We should be embracing this. We've had discussions with this property owner, And of course, that's for sale, $12 million. I don't have $12 million, but someday we're going to make a connection there that takes advantage of that property. And we actually don't mind if Semstone and aggregate industries continue to operate there, because it's the nature of the upper river and the working riverfront idea. This is an early version of the 26th Avenue North overlook. This is something that we're also partnering with Minneapolis Parks Foundation. We will have this constructed within about 1.5 years, and it will provide us a landing point on the river from North Minneapolis. We're also looking at how we can, in the long term, work, and it has to be long term because it's a railroad, how we can work with Burlington Northern Railroad to take advantage of a bridge that serves, that brings rail service to 2 businesses on the west side of the river. If those 2 businesses didn't need rail service, we could develop this as another loop and link across the river. So this is part of our plan. And then we get to Upper Harbor Terminal. This is the terminal. This was the port of Minneapolis. These structures, these big dome structures, these towers and these cantilevers and gantries are still there. There's a large factory, large warehouse building that today grows mushrooms. We're working with the city of Minneapolis to evolve this into new development and parkland. And this parcel is 48 acres. 20 acres along the riverfront will become parkland. And it will include potentially a performance center, some kind of a performance center, probably not a marina. I'll show another picture in a minute that tells you some of the problems with having. The River First was a design competition that was won by a landscape architecture firm from California and an architecture firm from New York. And sometimes they don't really understand in a competition what's really going on in the city. But the potential for a performing arts center is still there on the riverfront in North Minneapolis. It's kind of evolved into this. This looks a little bit blurry, which is kind of okay because it'll change many times before it actually gets built. And also on that same parcel of land, we'll be hopefully creating the North Side Wetlands Park, which is boardwalks and kind of a braided stream approach to how we can begin introducing people, kayakers, walkers, and the landscape together in a unique kind of park environment on the Mississippi River in North Minneapolis. And then I'm going to jump down because I had been working with the park board as a consultant in 2011, started working there permanently in 2000. I don't know, I shouldn't say permanently. Tom knows that. It's my full-time job in 2015, and one of the first things I got involved in was the way that this parcel of land would work. This is Hall's Island. This was Hall's Island. Hall's Island was lost when Scheer Brothers Lumber Company decided to fill in the channel here. And so just a couple years ago, it looked like this. The island used to be out in here. This was the channel. So when I came to the park board, one of our efforts was to build an island, of all things, to build an island on the Mississippi River. We need special legislation in order to do it. So this is what it would eventually look like. We had a design done, we had evolutions of that design, and this is where you get the Californians and the New Yorkers together and they think, well, we're going to build an island, there's going to be a beach, and people are going to be swimming in the river, and we said, no, that's not going to happen. And in fact, what the island needs to be is about habitat. It's a series of places for birds and other animals to come together in the river. And in fact, instead of having this be for swimming, we're working very hard to try and reintroduce mussels into that channel with the proper substrate to advance mussel populations in the upper river. So this is last winter, 2018, we build islands in the river. One of the things in the winter, we build islands in the winter. And by the end of the winter, we had an island beginning to take shape. And by June, we had Hall's Island constructed. There's no way for people to get out there yet. Eventually, there will be bridges at either end and a boardwalk to constrain people to a certain portion of this island. But this is a significant thing for us. This is how we imagine the evolution of the upper riverfront in Minneapolis. And it's a really important element for us. But it's also important that as we're doing this, we're engaging the people of North and Northeast Minneapolis whose skins are different than anyone else in this room. It's really important for us to understand the way that they begin to come to the river and understand the ecology, the systems that we're working very hard to create. So we're engaging them with wilderness inquiry in their giant canoes. We're getting people out on the river who have never paddled before, getting them out in kayaks on the Mississippi River and helping them understand what a great ecosystem this is and how they're living just blocks away from it. So that's River First. On the other end of the city, we have Hiawatha. And like Hiawatha, there's a significant historic personality, Theodore Wirth, who would sit in his office and decide that Minnehaha Creek had too many bends in it, so we'll straighten it out. Or that Cedar Lake, Lake of the Isles, and what's now called Bedeh-Makaska were separated by 6 feet, but wouldn't it be better if they were all at the same level? Doing things we would never imagine doing today. He would sit in his office at Lindale Farmstead Park and create plans for all these great new parks. And I've kind of looked at myself and my job as kind of de-worthing the Minneapolis park system in a way. So here's what he saw with Rice Lake. It was, in here you can see Minnehaha Creek flowing into it from one side and flowing out from the other side. Here's what it might have looked like when he looked at it. He might not have seen this as anything but an opportunity to be something else. And so what was imagined, here it is from the air, and you can begin to see Minnehaha Parkway being developed here, but here you can see Minnehaha Creek leading in and then out. And in order to do this great idea his idea was basically to dredge 1.25 million cubic yards of soil from Rice Lake and put it on the shore, put it on the west shore to create a golf course. And in order to do this great thing, we'll charge everybody within this zone a little bit extra on their property taxes. And so it was probably at the time a little bit extra, and now to put it back to what it should be, we can't burden these people with it, but it's a huge project that we're looking at doing. So I look at this picture often. This is Park Board Commissioner Maud Armitage christening the dredge. And I think often I could have used whatever was in that bottle a whole lot better today than she was using it back then. So we put dredges out there and we would reshape that landscape. We would grade out the golf course to the point where now we have this, the shining lake. The creek is now down here. You can kind of see it used to go through here. And we have a golf course. And initially, this was all great, but those soils that they dredged were put on top of organic soils and they would sink. They would compress the soils below. And so now we have a major ecological problem because somebody thought they could do nature better. This is the comparison. The blue is current Lake Hiawatha, this boundary here with all those ins and outs, and the creek over here was the bounds of Rice Lake. And just to give you a little more example, this park is on the south end of the Grand Rounds, and it's part of a much larger park called Nokomis Hiawatha Regional Park. But what happens sometimes is nature catches up with us, and Lake Hiawatha is over here until June and July of 2014, when it breached a berm and flooded the golf course. And it stayed that way for 2 months. And it happens, here's another view of it. People look at it and say, well, it's kind of beautiful. It's like, yeah, it is, and it's probably what it should have stayed like before Wirth started drawing his plans. But what we discovered was that we were pumping water. In order to make this golf course dry, we had to pump water from the property out into the lake. And the amount we were pumping is 242 million gallons a year. So to put that into context, a small to medium-sized Minnesota town, their domestic water needs are about the same. There are about 16,000 permits for appropriating water through the DNR. And there's one that's a nuclear power plant that's 235 million. It's less than this. We were trying to figure out where to really stand. 235 million gallons of water is a lot of water every year. And we have to do it because, so that when we discovered this, we were just about to talk about how we're going to restore Lake Hiawatha's golf course into a playable new golf course. We had all these ideas before we knew we were pumping 235 million gallons. And so, lucky me, I had to stand in front of a group of people and say for 2 hours, I don't know yet what's going on. Now I know what's going on, and I know we need to be on a different path. But this is the problem. Today, we pump from the golf course into Lake Hiawatha 242 million gallons. If we stop pumping, most of the golf course would fill up to the same level as Lake Hiawatha. We pump so that the water stays down here. When we stop pumping, it would fill up to there in about 2 weeks. So we have to keep pumping to keep the golf course dry. What's odd about this is we were pumping the water initially. Our permit says we can pump water to irrigate the golf course. So we pump 30 million gallons to keep it wet and 242 million gallons to keep it dry. And we noted that there are homes that are nearby that have basements that could be flooded if we stop pumping. I went to the DNR and said, are you going to tell us to stop pumping? We're breaking the law. Are you going to have us stop pumping? And they said, not yet. They don't want us to flood out. But here's what it turns into. Here's the golf course, the bounds of the golf course on the west side of the lake. If we stop pumping, the blue is what it equalizes at the elevation of the lake. The area that's in white is the area that's within 1 foot of that. The area that we feel through capillary action will stay wet. You wouldn't be able to walk on it, you wouldn't be able to drive on it. So most of the golf course would be compromised if we stop pumping. We haven't stopped pumping yet. We have been going through a series of explorations about what is going on with our world. Kenny Blumenthal from the State Climatology Office has been helping us understand the trends that we're in right now. And basically, we've had 6 years of rain in the last 5 years, an extra 65 million gallons of water falling from the sky. And that water is falling at a time when it can't infiltrate in the ground because it's frozen and the plants aren't growing because it's outside of the growing season. That water is going into the groundwater and it's raising the groundwater under Lake Hiawatha and Lake Nokomis by 3 to 4 inches, causing significant problems and a different kind of ecology than what we ever would have imagined. In fact, when Worth excavated the lake, we were in a 10-year drought, probably the most significant drought. And what I face now is that people want it to be like it was when Worth did his work. I can't put it back because I don't control the water that's falling out of the sky. So we're looking at, as we plan for the future, we're looking at what the changes will be, what the likely increase in water falling out of the sky, and actually questioning what model do we even use to predict runoff and hydrology. The models that we have aren't going to work for us if these trends continue. So we end up with this predicament on this 163 acres of Hiawatha, where it can be at times where the golf course can be a lake and where the creek might turn into a path. And any one of these could happen just with the variability we have in our weather systems today. We also look upstream and know that there's a 970-acre watershed. All the runoff from this entire portion of Minneapolis, this is Lake Street up here. So 970 acres all comes down to that point right there on the north side of Lake, right there in Lake Hiawatha. All of this water flows through our park, our lake, and it causes problems. And people say it's beautiful, and I'm saying, look at it. This is the golf course. This is Lake Hiawatha Golf Course. And it gets broken because most people who aren't golfers are saying, I want to be out there too. And under our equity principles, we're saying, yeah, they probably should be out there. We have trash collecting from a huge outlet. There's a gentleman who's collected tons of trash and actually turned it into artworks. I've promised him that we will, in our evolutions of Lake Hiawatha, we'll be looking at different ways of dealing with trash. We'll be looking at different ways of even thinking about the health of the lake. Lake Hiawatha is an impaired water. And I was meeting with representatives from the city of Minneapolis, and we were talking about a stormwater ordinance, and they were they turned things into numbers about phosphorus and TMDLs, and I said, no, our goal, we want to swim, it needs to be safe to swim in this lake. So we need to go from this to having kids swim in a lake again, like we can do in many places in Minnesota. We also look at golf. I'm not going to spend much time explaining the chart, but you can see pretty clearly the trends in golf are not good. This is Lake Hiawatha with rounds of golf and and then golf courses of our 7 golf courses in Minneapolis. All of them are seeing decreases in rounds of golf. So now we jump ahead. So we figured out all this stuff about what was going on. We started a process to understand how we're going to deal with water, how we're going to deal with the pumping, and we compared 2 different ideas about how we could manage the water, and we presented things to our Board of Commissioners, and they encouraged, and I think rightly so, for us to pursue alternative B, which says we're going to take water from the storm sewer and water from the creek, and we're going to create a new ecology on top of the golf course. We're going to say that, and this is the de-worthing. This is trying to say what happened when Worth created the golf course was the wrong thing to do, and now we have to find a way to put it back. And in the process, keep, it seems, tens of thousands of people happy as we go through there. We have 3 different concepts, and they originally had different names. Concept 1 was, and this is me sitting on a Sunday morning telling my consultant team that the first concept you need to look at is just let it go. We're going to break the berm, we're going to let the water flow into the golf course, and we're going to see what happens. We're going to let nature take over the way that it normally would. We had a second scheme where we said, if we have to have golf here, we're going to organize this to have the best possible golf course. And then the third was our consultants renamed it back to nature. My name for it was Worth in Reverse, where Worth spent incredible energy trying to make the golf course. We're going to use that same kind of energy to put it back into the kind of landscape that it should be. So we have, in those 2 schemes, in the last 2 schemes, we have 9 holes of golf, not 18. But it'll be a different kind of golf. It'll be golf that's driven by ecology. We're not going to reshape entire areas to create a great golf hole. We're going to use ecology to create a great golf hole. It will look different. It will play like golf. It'll probably play better than how Hiawatha Golf Course plays for golf today. We're going to make certain that as we look at this, that significant portions of the property are paddleable or more areas accessible to the lake, that we have new ways, new pathways, new types of experiences for people who are walking, for biking, the major users of our park system, for expanding the way people use this property in winter. My thing now is if we change the way we're pumping, we can't eliminate pumping altogether because we'll probably have impacts on people's homes nearby. So we can probably go from 242 million to 90 million gallons. So I have 90 million gallons of water that I can find something to do with. And one of the things we might do is actually make snow, as much as climate change is happening, making snow so that people can cross-country ski by jumping across the street and into a park. Creating places, this is actually a created landscape. This is not a natural landscape. Our consultants, Berger from Portland and Barr from Minneapolis, this is one of the landscapes that Berger created. So we'll create landscapes for people in isolation. We'll create landscapes for play, for unique kind of play. We'll play with elevation and topography so that there are different kinds of experiences across an area that's today almost all flat. We'll look for how we can integrate pathways and walking areas and topography with wetlands and other unique portions of the landscape. We'll introduce art as a different way to experience ecology. What happens is when you look through that hole, you actually see a specific thing in the landscape. So we're going to work hard to help people experience the landscape in entirely new ways. By providing overlooks with story panels that are built to the size of kids so the kids understand hydrology and what's going on. How we can use natural features to create maybe kind of temporal features of the landscape. How we can build places that have great ecologic function and great beauty, but not in the way that Loring Park was created as kind of a pastoral landscape, but in ways that actually have high-functioning ecology, in ways that we deal with stormwater that are interesting instead of digging a hole and putting a fence around it and saying we're doing a good job with stormwater management. And even looking really broadly to say, what is the wildest idea that we could ever think of? Could we ever imagine an elk in a tuxedo playing a grand piano in an event in the park? If we could find a way to make that happen and it would resonate with ecology, we would make this happen. So again, it's ecology and equity driving park design, both of which are kind of the paramount concerns as we look at the next evolution of parks in Minneapolis. This is Isaac Walton. So it's interesting to look at quotes. He was all about water. So when I look at these two things, if we can find ways to introduce people to the wonders of waters in Minneapolis, where when I finish my job, or when I hand it off to the next person who's in my position, the goal is that every water body in Minneapolis will be bounded by public space. Every piece of water in Minneapolis will be accessible, fully accessible to the public. That's the goal we're working under, and it seems it resonates exactly with Walton's statement. So thank you very much. Yeah, so Jill said we couldn't do this if we weren't an independent body. I think it's a really good point. That if you look at our specific charge is dealing with parks in Minneapolis. If you go to City Hall, they have hundreds of other concerns. But it is interesting to think about this. In fact, to put it into better context. And I think really important and appropriate context. I tell my staff, I tell my consultants, I tell anybody who's applying for a job at the park system that we can look at them and they can talk about the legacy of Minneapolis, and they say the legacy of Minneapolis is parks, and I say, no, you've got it completely wrong. The legacy of parks in Minneapolis is parks innovation. We're doing things, we started different. We had a group of citizens tell us we needed to be different. So even though we're building parks, the goal is to think about them differently, to try and imagine how parks should be in this century, different than last century, but based on innovation. We're not trying to copy anybody else. We have lots of people coming to find out what we're doing. We have this kind of for 6 years, the park system in Minneapolis has been voted the #1 park system in the country by the Trust for Public Land. And I tell people, yeah, that's great, but it's based on kind of legacy geography. They count the number of parks we have. We have lots of parks that are close to lots of people. But it's the equity measures we're taking. It's the fact that we put equity into an ordinance. It's the fact that we're creating islands in the Mississippi River, that we're allowed to buy land and manage it as commercial or industrial land until a time when we can turn it into parkland to serve the people of Minneapolis. That's what makes us different, and I think that's what allows these things to happen. All right, thank you.